All right, everyone, let's kick this off this week's MetPro Meetup. And hello, my name is Tom, and I am thrilled that today we're privileged to be joined by Dr. Tamanna K. Singh. Dr. Singh is a highly accredited individual in sports cardiology and cardiovascular medicine at the Cleveland Clinic. Dr. Singh is also an esteemed fellow of the American College of Cardiology. And Dr. Singh is a runner and works with Coach Natalie here at MetPro. So thrilled that she's chosen to join us today. In addition, we have Coach Natalie, and Natalie is one of our lead coaches. She's got her bachelor's and her master's in nutrition and many certifications, registered dietitian, nutritionist, and she's board certified as a specialist in sports dietetics. Beyond all that, she worked as a clinical dietitian many years prior to joining MetPro, and she's been with MetPro for many years. And beyond all that, she's a super nice person to get to work with on a daily basis. So Dr. Singh and Natalie, thank you for joining us today.
Thanks so much for having us.
Yeah. Now, for those of you who are joining us and perhaps you are a little bit unfamiliar with MetPro, just to be clear, even though we're privileged to have these very intelligent and accomplished people with us today, to be clear, MetPro is not a medical organization. We're about transforming lives through fitness, through wellness, through coaching, nutrition. So anything shared today should not be considered medical advice. MetPro is not designed to treat any illness, disease, or adverse medical condition. So all of us at MetPro are passionate about promoting wellness and quality of life, but we don't provide medical nutrition therapy or advocate a particular diet. The science that drives MetPro is about this individualized, unique metabolism, which I know we're going to cover today with Dr. Singh and Natalie. So with that, I would like to dive in. If you have joined us today and you've got questions, please add those in the chat. I think we're going to be able to cover a lot of topics. Just to get things started, though, I'd like to ask you, Dr. Singh, tell us a little bit about yourself. Tell us about the work you're doing at the Cleveland Clinic so we can get to know you a little bit better.
Sure. So I'm the co-director of our Sports Cardiology Center at the Cleveland Clinic. So basically what we do is multiple things. We participate in taking care of athletes who actually have cardiovascular disease or cardiovascular symptoms, abnormalities. We take care of athletes who are looking for any sort of pre-participation screening, so particular collegiate and our professional athletes. We do a lot of work with respect to trying to reduce the incidence and risk of sudden cardiac death, which is also tied into our screening. And then we also have a role in education with our cardiology fellows, as well as the residents in the program who are interested in sports cardiology. So that's kind of what I do from a clinical side. From a research standpoint, the things that I'm particularly interested in are nutrition and how it ties into athletic performance, because there's a lot of things out there, as we'll talk about, with respect to, what can optimize performance. And as a cardiologist, I'm always thinking about what can minimize cardiovascular risk, and they really do go hand in hand. I'm also, spending a lot of time looking at our patients who have post-COVID syndrome, and particularly with autonomic dysfunction, which is related to a lot of the exertional intolerance and brain fog and high heart rates that we're seeing in athletes and in non-athletes. So those are kind of the things that are occupying my brain these days.
Super. And if I can go to this next slide, in addition to all these very advanced things that you're doing, you're also a runner. So tell us about that.
Yeah. So, when I was just starting medical school, I had probably gained about 30 pounds in college, and I was really active through my younger years as a figure skater and did ballet and whatnot. And but I obviously gained kind of the college 30. And so I started to just run, I think more so for weight loss, tried to clean up my diet a little bit. And then when I started my sports cardiology fellowship at Mass General, a lot of them were runners, and they had said, "You will catch the bug." And I was like, no. I'll run a couple of miles each week. And then slowly but surely, a couple of miles each week turned into a 10-miler, turned into a half. And then what's a marathon? Just 2 halves. And then, I just kind of kept going.
I see. And it looks like as you're holding up this medal, where was this located? This was earlier this year.
Yeah, so this is just about 6 weeks ago in Charlevoix in Michigan, Northern Michigan. That was marathon number 3 for me. So Natalie has obviously heard all about my, I'm very verbose with how I describe my training and, kind of as we're progressing through our up and down adjust. So this was a good one for me, a PR, a little bit of a fluke injury after, but it was a beautiful course. If any of you are runners, just absolutely beautiful. I definitely encourage you to go out there and check it out.
Nice. Well, I know that we have some people that are runners joining us today. So that if you have any running questions and places to go, definitely ask those between Natalie and Dr. Singh. So I know you wanted to cover some different topics. We were talking about nutrition, cardiovascular risk, athletic performance. Can we kind of just jump into this?
Yeah, sure.
Great.
So I guess, if you have any questions, the main thing as a cardiologist, what, I always look at, and I kind of call myself a minimalist when it comes to medical therapy for individuals. I mean, you have a lot of people who either have cardiac disease or you have individuals who are worried about getting cardiac disease. And you can do this for both groups. And so one of the things that our American College of Cardiology and American Heart Association really look at our lifestyle determinants, of which diet and nutrition, you can kind of see in that pie chart, are components of. And, one of the things I want to highlight is, we hear a lot about cancer and we hear a lot about therapies and prevention and screening. But I think one of the things that we forget is the burden of cardiovascular disease. And, more than 500,000 people have died from heart disease. And that's data quoted from about 6 years ago, and that just continues to rise, particularly in tandem with the obesity epidemic. And you can even see here that contributed to about a 1% risk in heart disease deaths at that time, after 4 decades of an actual decline in cardiovascular disease related deaths. And so nutrition is a huge component of reducing cardiovascular risk. In fact, you can reduce your risk by just about 80% if you are able to optimize your weight, optimize your cholesterol, improve your blood pressure, and manage your blood sugar or your risk for diabetes. Nutrition can really do all of that for you, and 80% is huge.
That is significant.
So some of the nutritional recommendations from our large organizations, as I mentioned, the ACC and the AHA, look primarily at probably the most kind of trustworthy data that we have, or the best diet data that we have, which are basically based upon the Mediterranean diet or the Predimed study, as well as the DASH diet. But there's a lot more data, more observational studies that are looking at plant-based Mediterranean style diets, so diets that are very low or if no saturated fat. And these types of diets are really associated with lower risk of all-cause mortality. So disease burden really declines. So we always talk a lot about optimizing our unsaturated fat consumption, our fruits, our nuts and our seeds and our avocados and our olive oils, really improving our consumption of fruits and vegetables, really trying to eat the rainbow, if you can kind of think about it that way, and minimizing our animal consumption. And if we do choose to eat animal protein, really favoring the lean protein. There is actually a study that I came across a couple of years ago that compared white meat to red meat with respect to how atherogenic or how prone they are to mediating cardiovascular disease. And they also compared those two types of meat to plant-based protein. And what was really interesting was plant-based protein still won out when it came to what was more atherogenic. So even white meat is atherogenic because of the saturated fat content. And that sat fat is really what lines your coronary arteries. The unsaturated fat from plant-based sources does not contribute to the coronary disease, the plaque accumulation, that soft, squishy cholesterol that you get in your blood vessels. So I think that's kind of one of the key points in my biased opinion I typically tell, but we have a lot of data supporting that now. There was another study, the Adventist Health Study 2 cohort, that also showed that meat protein was associated with a 61% increase in mortality rate. And when you actually replace that meat with nuts and seeds, you can see a 40% reduction. So these are not tiny numbers, these are large. And then with respect to dairy, dairy is quite a controversial product. There was one study, the Pure study, that showed that dairy consumption was associated with about a quarter or 23% mortality reduction, whereas another one shows an increase in mortality with dairy when you compare them to plant-based proteins. So the takeaway really, I think, from here is we live in a world which is driven by meat consumption, whether it's economical or political or social or cultural. And one of the things I typically try to tell my patients, athletes and non-athletes, is think outside of the box. Really look and shop the periphery of the grocery store, because you can hit your macros just with plants, and really trying to minimize those other animal sources to keep your cardiovascular risk low.
Super. I'm gonna pause before I move forward. I have a question that somebody posed. I'll just if they put this in the chat, I'll share it out. If we could, and maybe Dr. Singh, if you want to answer this, or Natalie, if you want to chime in with both of you. If I want to work both HIIT running and steady state cardio, as well as strength training into my exercise regimen, what are your recommendations to best utilize both fat stores and glycogen stores?
That's a good question. I feel like by doing all of those things, you're going to be best utilizing. So, your coach, if you're working with someone currently, will definitely be able to help you with this. But, by doing all of those things, your body you never use one system. You're going to use all of them. There's just certain systems that are going to prioritize fat loss or using fat versus glycogen. And so I think just having, designated days where you are doing HIIT, endurance cardio, or like that steady state cardio and strength, you're going to be maximizing that. So whether it's, it kind of depends on the person in terms of how many days, and then are they training for a race, or are they just looking for body composition shifts? That's the other way in terms of like how many days of what you should do. So that's kind of hard to answer, but that's kind of my initial thought on that question.
Yeah, and you usually tell me the same thing, Natalie, with respect to, when we discuss what is going to be our source. And I typically think about, high intensity style exercises to be associated with the need for more carbohydrate consumption and utilization, right? Versus looking at low intensity, kind of that sustainable type of exercise, which you can sometimes see in, just the steady state cardio utilizing fat and fat stores more so than the carbohydrates. So that's kind of how I think about it.
Excellent. And just another question here while we're in this mode. And this, I think, would be oriented to you, Natalie, but I'm curious also, Dr. Singh, about your experience. Natalie, for you, my coach keeps talking about down adjusting and up adjusting. What are those?
Yes. So that's our term for kind of toggling your intake. So down adjusting, I always explain to people when the lower we go in terms of numbers of phases, the less food is on your plate. The higher we go, the opposite. So we're kind of pulling that lever depending on where you are in the process. Down adjusting, meaning kind of synonymous with like a fat loss, weight loss cycle, and up adjusting with a building cycle, performance cycle. You can kind of call that the same thing. So that is the difference. Higher intake versus lower.
Gotcha. Thank you.
Yeah.
I imagine as you're training for both of you as runners, are you very conscious and thinking about all these cycles and the up adjust and down adjust as you're in that training mode?
Yeah, I was going to say, that's a huge factor for, all my runners is when is your race, and is it an A race? Is it are we shooting for a PR, or are you just using this as a training race? We've done lots and lots of cycles with Tamanna, and, I feel like every race is better and better. So we are definitely prioritize performance for her races.
And having a coach, like, I don't have to think about it, right? Natalie does all of the thinking for me. I just have to ask her, where are we going? And she's great about trying to figure out what I need. What I do, my secret really is just constantly sign up for races. So you're always in an up adjust. You're never in a down, right?
Yes.
I'm kidding. That's a joke. But it's good. I think what I've learned with her really is just how to eat for my performance versus kind of thinking about the quantity of what I was eating before I really got into MetPro and learned a lot more about it. So.
I understand. Great. Thank you. Well, I wanted to go to this next slide, Dr. Singh, that you had that I thought was very interesting. Can you walk us through this? And I know that there's some arrows and things in animation, but can you walk us through this slide?
Yeah, so there's a lot of text on this slide, but the basic takeaway here is this is a summary of a lot of studies that are looking at different dietary patterns. So breaking it down by types of foods or components is how they described it. And what we're looking at here is seeing what they're associated, or I should say, how much risk they're associated with respect to cardiovascular disease. So when you see that line in the middle and all these dots, the dots to the right of the line show that those types of diet components are associated with greater risk or greater incidence, I should say, of cardiovascular disease. And the dots to the left of the line are associated with less. So if we start at the top, you're going to see that the two huge dots that are really to the right of the line are processed meats and refined grains, which are kind of huge no-nos in the MetPro community as well as in the cardiovascular community. Those types of foods are pretty pro-inflammatory, are associated with increases in cholesterol levels, can also lead to dysregulation of blood glucose levels, weight gain, obesity, and all of that together can lead to really a type of metabolic syndrome, and cardiovascular disease incidence and risk goes up. If we go down all the way to the dietary patterns, I thought this was interesting. You'll also see that there's a dot to the right of the line associated with the Western diet. What is the Western diet? The way we kind of describe it in the cardiovascular world is really kind of that Southern diet, the fried food diet, the very heavy in animal protein consumption diet, really kind of what you think about, and this may be a generalization, but I'll try to be as conscious about it as possible, but really kind of the all-American diet. And now if we shift to our focus to the diets or to the dots to the left of the line, just starting at the top and even at the bottom. So actually, let's start at the top. So you can see here that when you look at fruits and vegetables, nuts and whole grains, all of those are associated with less cardiovascular disease incidence. They're markedly away from that line. And the further you are from the line, the greater the incidence if you're to the right, or the less the incidence if you're to the left. So you can see, starting from dairy all the way to whole grains, the more plant-based you get, the less incidence there is. And then if you go down to the dietary patterns, so the DASH diet is basically a low salt diet. And then you have these other types of Mediterranean diets, kind of heart healthy diets that are all, again, predicated on fruits and vegetable consumption, legume consumption, really, green, clean, lean types of diets. And they also do incorporate some lean protein. All of those are associated with less cardiovascular incidence. So the huge takeaway here is the style of eating that most of us follow, perhaps maybe not in this group, but when I say most of us, just within our culture, Western, high processed meat, refined grain consumption explains why our cardiovascular disease burden is so high. So if you really focus on eating the rainbow, like I said, eating a very clean plate, which, we really do with MetPro when we take a look at what's available in the app, when we're looking at our macros, what we can consume, all of those foods fall well within these categories that are associated with reduced cardiovascular disease incidence. So you can see everything really goes hand in hand. Your nutrition quality directly correlates to your cardiovascular risk.
Excellent. Thank you. While we're on this topic, a question came in. What are your top recommendations for proteins that are plant-based? And this individual says, I tend to rely mostly on meat since nuts tend to be compounded with fats and am limited in my intake depending on my current meal plan.
Yeah, so I'm vegan. So when I first started MetPro, Natalie was entirely helpful with kind of describing what plant foods are really like, and they tend to be combo macros. So I can see what you're talking about with nuts having that, both fat and protein content. Nearly all plant-based foods tend to have a combo macro. So at least within the plan that I've been following, I've been able to still hit my protein needs with nut consumption, with tofu consumption. Beans are a little tricky because you have that carbohydrate component combined with your protein. If you're looking for a pure protein, you could try plant-based protein powders. The ones that I've liked, I think Vega is probably the one that doesn't have much carbohydrate content, and I don't remember what the fat is, but it's like 18 or 20 grams of protein. The two brands that I really like now that do have, I think, 10 to 13 grams of carbohydrates, but their fat is also low. I think it's less than what one fat would correlate to in MetPro, which I think is 10 grams, would be Momentous, the plant protein. And then I'm a huge fan of Four Sigmatic, which is a mushroom brand that does protein powders. I really like their cocoa. So that's kind of how I get around, trying to maximize protein consumption without really going too high on fat. But I think I've kind of come to peace with, I'd rather eat a little more fat with my protein, knowing that it's coming from a healthy source, than change my diet entirely and go from plant-based to, animal protein because I'm looking for a pure protein. But that's my personal bias. And Natalie can probably speak to how to get around it much more than I can. But that's kind of what I've done in my personal experience.
Yeah, I was just going to add, working with, like, if someone comes to me and says, I want to incorporate more plants, how do we do this? And they're on a lower phase, it's a little bit, trickier because, like Tamanna said, the proteins coupled with fat and or carbs typically. And so there are some that are lower that we kind of go towards on lower phases versus when you are on an up adjust. I mean, have all the beans, lentils, whatever, doesn't matter as much. But tofu and tempeh, those are options that, they do have some level of like the compound foods, but the coach, is able to help you kind of factor that in. So for vegans, generally, we kind of manipulate the carbohydrate a little bit differently than for non-vegans. So what that means is, maybe we're not as restrictive with carbohydrates in order to make sure that someone can meet their needs, carbohydrate, protein, and fat wise. So we kind of have to cater to that. But there are options. I always encourage people, like, whether you are vegetarian or vegan, I mean, it doesn't matter. You don't have to be, but what can you add to your diet to make it, better? So plant wise, instead of like, I can't eat this or that, thinking about what you can add.
Right. Thank you. Dr. Singh, somebody asked, would you please repeat the name of those three brands of plant proteins you mentioned again?
Sure. So Natalie introduced me to Vega, so VEGA, and they have, it's a pretty tasty. I think for all of them, I'll tell you what I do. The second one, my favorite, is Four Sigmatic, FOURSIGMATIC. And I'm a huge fan of their cocoa. They also have peanut butter and vanilla. Peanut butter is not bad either. And then Momentous. If you, kind of follow a lot of the athlete kind of social media, Momentous is huge in terms of really being great source of protein, as well as MCTs and whatnot. And they have a good plant-based protein powder. Carbohydrate content will differ. So Four Sigmatic is usually what I'll do for one meal carb, and to hit I think it's 2 protein for breakfast. I can't remember. And then Momentous also is almost 1 meal carb. So you can get away with adding like a little bit of frozen banana, which kind of gives it a little more of a kick.
Thank you. And that, as you were describing all of that, my ears perked up at cocoa. That's what I heard. And the whole I heard cocoa.
Yeah, I love all the chocolate flavors. So Momentous chocolate is great too. I think they do like a vanilla chai or something also for plant-based. But I love the chocolates.
That's great. Well, moving past this, I'd like to go on to this next slide. Could you walk us through this, Dr. Singh?
Yeah. So, as you can see here, athletes kind of come in all different shapes and sizes. And, the downside, I think, of some sports is that we are promoting a specific look or specific body composition to meet a goal. And I say that, highlighting our obese football player in the top left. And here, what I'm trying to mention is that for the type of performance that we're looking for, even if you are a lineman on a professional football team, there is a way to eat optimally that will still enhance your performance, because eating a lot of garbage for the sake of gaining weight so that you can take on the force of your opposing teammate is not going to do you right when it comes to performance. Eating excessively, eating those processed foods leads to a lot of fatigue, can lead to injury, can lead to inflammation, and just subpar athleticism. So that's kind of what I'm getting at here. Another thing, just highlighting kind of the bottom down, we're runners, right? So in the running community, and I tend to see a lot of collegiate athletes and even older recreational athletes, weight becomes a huge thing, getting to quote unquote race weight, or, being influenced by how people around you look, other fellow runners, and body composition and, body dysmorphism is a huge deal. And the importance here is that being deficient in calories leads to nutritional deficiencies, can lead to things like relative energy deficiency in sport, losing your periods, getting anemic, breaking bones. All of those things lead to suboptimal performance. And nutrition can keep you out of those states and really keep you as healthy as possible, so that as you get older, your performance just continues to get better. And then steroids, there's some people out there who do use steroids. There's a role for steroids in people who have some sort of deficiency, like testosterone deficiency. But in people who don't, if you use anabolic steroids, there's a direct correlation with accelerated and premature coronary disease incidence, as well as developing hearts that can become weaker and stiffer. So these are, just several things where even though you want to look a certain way or want to perform a certain way, it's always good to think about your performance in a more holistic approach versus it being directly correlated to what your body shape is and what your body type is. Your nutrition will take you where you need to go, not how your body necessarily looks.
As a follow-up to that, Dr. Singh, a question came in. I'll pose it to you first, and then Natalie, I'm curious your thoughts as well. This individual said, I'm a slightly older 50 runner, and I'm worried about ensuring I get enough calcium. I'm happy not to eat dairy and would prefer not to take supplements, but eat real food. What do you suggest? And Dr. Singh, I'll start that question with you.
Yeah, so you can get like calcium fortified non-dairy milks. You can also get calcium from greens. I feel like Natalie is really good at, just for being a fantastic dietitian, at breaking that down to the nitty gritty. But if you don't want to take supplements, I think those are probably the two types of sources I would start with.
Yeah, I was going to also say the fortified plant milks, but I mean, MetPro, you have the option to meet your needs if you're doing it right, I guess I should say. So if you want to choose the best foods on the food list and avoid supplementation, you can do that. It's just being a little bit more strategic. So nuts, seeds, greens, like lentil pasta, bean pastas, in addition to beans and lentils by themselves. There's ways to kind of add that in. But, in addition to that, aging women runners need to be doing strength training too for like bone density. So not just thinking about, are you getting enough calcium? But if you're not doing strength training, that might even have a better impact for you. So, yeah.
Natalie, can you dive into that a little bit more about the strength training for runners? Like, what kind of strength training activities would you think of, and where to begin with MetPro in that? Maybe if somebody's using the app.
Yeah, well, we have a special section that the team and I created for runners. It's just 2 days a week. And if you ask your coach, they can guide you to where that is, because it's not straightforward in terms of finding it on there. But kind of, we only made it 2 days a week, knowing that our runners are primarily running, but also wanting to encourage them to do strength training. But there's everything. It's not necessarily that just runners, would benefit from these workouts. It's, the same stuff bodybuilders are doing as well. But in terms of, going back to the original thing, I think she's referring to like calcium for bone health and that sort of deal. But, bone density can also be maintained with strength training and resistance training. And so that's where I was meaning, like, that is also an important factor for aging women just in general.
And just to give you some foods, I have a cheat sheet, so bear with me. Nuts and seeds, almonds, tofu and edamame, and what else do I have on my list? Leafy greens we already talked about, like spinach and kale, and interestingly, rhubarb. So make some rhubarb pie in a MetPro friendly way. That is going to be my challenge for Cassie, for Natalie. Rhubarb pie.
Right.
Cocoa and rhubarb pie. That's what I've heard so far. Staying with the theme here of nutrition, this was somebody who wrote, and as a former patient at the Cleveland Clinic, and for those of you who may not be aware, the Cleveland Clinic is quite renowned. So as a former patient at the Cleveland Clinic, I want to say thank you for all you do. Is there a preferred seafood you would recommend? And is there any seafood you would avoid? I love all types, but fish versus crustaceans versus shellfish, there has to be some differences. So Natalie, I'll start that question with you. Do you have any thoughts around seafood and what we recommend with MetPro?
Well, definitely it's hard because it's pricey, but wild caught over farmed would be like the number one whenever possible. I was just trying to remember the name of it. I think it's the Monterey Bay Aquarium has a fish kind of advisory little handout PDF that you can see where it shows kind of like the safest in terms of like toxins within them. But yeah, wild caught when possible. And I mean, that's kind of the number one is like quality, I would say, versus like those bottom feeders, like catfish, like people eat in the South, not worth eating, especially fried, versus like wild caught, salmon, trout, things like that. Most people don't eat like sardines or, those sorts of things. I think most of the time when people eat fatty fish, it's like a salmon, but there are other options that, if you're wondering about, you can always ask your coach, like, does this count towards a fatty fish or a lean protein? And we can definitely, let you know.
Thank you. Dr. Singh, in your research, any particular thoughts about the fish, crustacean, shellfish, such?
Not so much. I mean, it typically does go, at least the research shows, when we think about the Mediterranean diet, for instance, fatty fish are going to probably be the best with respect to getting your omegas and for cardiovascular disease reduction. But in terms of quality of fish, I think, I would echo what Natalie says, just really looking at the source and being mindful of the toxin level. That's going to be super important. But we have not, at least from what I know, there's really no breakdown with respect to, cardiovascular disease burden for fish versus shellfish or whatnot.
Thank you. This question came in, asked, I like the book Atomic Habits. What advice do you have for making simple but meaningful changes for my meal prep to make that more simple?
Do you want me to go for this, or you want to?
Yeah, Dr. Singh, would you kick off? What are your, maybe both what you've noticed professionally and then just in your own personal life as you're doing meal prep and things?
So I think this kind of is applicable to really anything you're trying to do when you're trying to set a habit, is planning and being consistent with that planning. So as you put out your workout clothes the night before, so you don't have to think about it the day after, that's kind of how I think about my meals. I like to do my prep usually on the weekend. And, I usually use my Thursdays or Fridays to think about what do I want to get from the grocery store. I make my list and I think about what ingredients I can utilize in different forms. So for different meals, so I don't have to be too complex. I'm a huge fan of roasting. Roasting vegetables is probably the easiest thing you can do when you're trying to get your veggies. I love salads, so summertime is super easy. I make probably a salad with 3 servings and then I just box it up and I've got my lunch for 3 days and I don't have to think about it. So if you take the thought process out and you do that thinking during a dedicated time, you're more likely to stick to consistency and you're more likely to actually see the fruits of your labor. The more time you spend every day thinking, oh man, I don't have lunch. What am I going to make for lunch? And you try to do it in real time, the more of a burden, at least for me, it seems to be. And the less inclined I am to stick to, my down or my up adjust. The easier it is to just, go on Uber Eats and try to pick something and order in. So preparation. And then, forgiveness as well, right? Give yourself a little grace if, not everything works in the plan that you thought. Try to avoid that frustration and just say, look, tomorrow's another day, but I'm going to be prepared for tomorrow. I'm going to pack my lunch, figure out what I want for dinner, and have that ready. So that way the next day is better than today.
Super. Thank you. How about for you, Natalie? I know you've, working with Dr. Singh and many other folks, what are some good ways for people to have some quick wins or good solid wins in meal prep, those atomic changes?
Yeah, I have been tested on this now having an infant at home. So I think for new clients, I kind of sometimes encourage certain individuals to start smaller than they think they need to. So maybe you're not, meal prepping, for 5 things a day. Maybe it's, just lunch. So kind of like getting a handle on one thing at a time and then building on that. And then the other thing is like just taking shortcuts. Like if you don't have time to, prep this carb or that protein, I usually typically, prep in bulk. So kind of simplify that route. But if that's even too much for you to handle, take shortcuts. Like, I will tell you what I have always is like cans or like they're little boxes now, but of like beans or pre-cooked lentils where you can just like the cooking is already done. I just measure. You can go out and buy proteins that are already cooked as well. So there's really like, if time's an issue, you can shortcut it and still be 100% on plan. So I think sometimes people forget you can make it simple.
And if you like organization, I think Natalie shared this with me. There's like an Amazon MetPro. I think there still is like a site where you can see all the things that can help you be successful with prep. Like, I love aesthetics. So I, of course, bought, 8 glass boxes that look all the same with 3 little compartments, or, jars for overnight oats. So there's like just lots of ways to be creative about
it. Excellent. Thank you. Thank you both. I'm going to go on to the next slide, Dr. Singh. And this was, you want to take us through this?
Oh yeah. So these 2 charts are probably my favorite and my 2 most shared with my patients because there's always questions about, I'm sorry, the dogs are nuts. There's always questions about whether eggs are good for you or bad for you, or like we saw, is dairy good or bad for you? And so we've done 2 nutritional controversy papers. The 3rd one is going to be out in publication hopefully later this year. And these are just fantastic illustrations with respect to what we do have evidence for in terms of benefit for cardiovascular disease prevention and what is harmful. And the orange is harm. The purple is inconclusive, and then the blue is what we typically recommend. And so I think one of the couple of things I want to highlight are just looking at refined oils. So I did mention, plant-based products are seemingly, much more healthier than animal-based. But if you look here, evidence of harm, one thing I want to highlight is coconuts. Coconuts are really, I think, the only plant source that are all saturated fat. And, there was a study that compared Eastern diets to Western diets, and the Western diets that were predicated on a lot of coconut milk use, for instance. Both of them were atherogenic, though coconuts led to a lesser degree of increase in cholesterol levels. So what I'm getting at is, that's something I typically would say use in moderation. If you're vegan or plant-based, coconuts tend to be used in a lot of baked items, which also have, refined or processed grains. So just something to be cognizant of. Eggs, we kind of concluded that there's more evidence that they're probably more harmful with respect to just the amount of cholesterol they have. The way I describe these to my patients is, the yolks are really full of a lot of B vitamins. Just be cognizant about how much you're eating. I would not eat 3 eggs a day. I'd probably say maybe a couple eggs a week, but I'd rather you eat a couple eggs a week than eat, I don't even know what McDonald's calls their burgers, but, eating something from McDonald's every day. Southern diets, we kind of already talked about this. Those again are high in fried food content, lots of oils, processed meats, definitely a big no-no in the cardiovascular world. Things we know are beneficial to our health and, like I said, athletic performance. Olive oil, avocado oil is also fantastic. Those are probably the 2 best high quality oils we've got. Berries for their antioxidants. Nuts and seeds, like we said, a fantastic source of combo protein and fat. But I always say kind of eat how Mother Nutrition has provided for us. So she provided an abundance of greens, eat those in copious amounts. She did not provide us with abundance of nuts and seeds. They're very calorically dense. So I usually say a palmful a day. And then plant-based proteins. The one caveat here is when you're thinking about plant-based proteins, I mentioned, as unprocessed as possible. There's a lot of processed plant-based proteins like the Impossible Burger or Impossible Meats. You got to look at the actual ingredients and you'll see there's a list of like 30, 35 ingredients of which I cannot even tell you what they are. I would rather you make a plant-based burger out of your own black beans and quinoa or sweet potato and whatnot than eat these Impossible Burgers. I think they're there for to meet a specific demand. I think it's still better than a real burger maybe, but there's just so much stuff in there that I typically counsel my patients and my athletes to just stick to what's clean, what you can read in terms of the ingredient list. And then on the right, as you can imagine, added sugars, sodas, all of those things are, going to really muck up your blood glucose levels, increase the risk for obesity and cardiovascular disease. And then energy drinks as well. There's a lot of like pre-workout drinks or, Red Bulls and all those things. Sometimes we see tied into athletic performance. I see a lot of patient athletes who come in with palpitations or heart racing sensations, sometimes chest pain, sometimes really just profound fatigue after the high of these energy drinks. And so we really say try to avoid them. They do increase blood pressure. And if you constantly drink them, they can cause arrhythmias or abnormal heart rhythms. Getting back to what's good for you, legumes we talked about. Tea can be really helpful. Mushrooms, I think mushrooms are probably one of the most underrated food source, super anti-inflammatory, have a lot of antioxidant benefits as well. Alcohol. So, alcohol is kind of a funny player. The American Heart Association recommends a drink per day for women. I think no more than 2 for men. And there has been evidence to suggest that there can be some anti-inflammatory properties. I still tell my patients really, consume in moderation, at least per the guidelines. And for my athletes who are really looking to maximize their performance, and you'll see this across the board with the pros and highly recreational individuals and maybe yourself, I just kind of say stay away from it. It's not really doing anything to enhance your performance. It's going to dehydrate you. And, you may just not hit your goals. Omega-3 is fantastic, and B12, particularly if you're plant-based, vitamin B12 can be something that you may be low in. And so that's something that I definitely supplement. And then here, you'll even see again, dairy. We're just unsure about where it falls in the grand scheme of things. And then fermented foods as well. There is some data like kimchi, for instance, people will say fermented foods may be actually healthy for you. We just don't have enough data to prove that.
Excellent. Dr. Singh, is a drill down question to that. Somebody asked, extra virgin olive oil is always recommended, but this individual doesn't prefer the taste. Is it okay if they use light olive oil instead? And I know that olive oil comes in different grades and things.
Yeah, I mean, I don't really see, I honestly don't know, if there is much difference. They're both unsaturated fats. Natalie might know this better than I do, but I'd rather use something like olive oil versus like a pressed sunflower or a palm oil, something along those lines. You can always try avocado oil. It is a little pricier, but a little goes a long way. And you can even get, the avocado oil spray versus, measuring a tablespoon or half tablespoon or whatever you want.
Yeah, I was just going to add, I think the light olive oil, to my knowledge, is slightly more, would be considered a little bit more refined, because it has a higher smoke point, but it's still going to be, like you said, better than all the other, oils out there. And then I always encourage, using an olive oil when you're not cooking, like as a dressing, and using avocado oil for cooking at higher temperatures. It's more stable in that form. So.
Excellent. Thanks. I'm going to move on to this slide. Dr. Singh, I'd love to hear your thoughts on this.
Yeah. So, I think before I started MetPro, and when did I start MetPro? I can't remember. I want to say maybe 2018 or 2019, maybe 2019, something like that. I think before I started MetPro, I probably was within the category of people who thought the less carbs I ate, the more fruits and vegetables I ate, the more I restricted my diet, the healthier I would be all across the board. And that's just a very generic way of eating, but a very common way to eat. And when I say individualized nutrition, I think what MetPro helped me realize was even within an app, even within, having selection of foods that other MetPro clients have, my way of eating is still being manipulated by my coach to suit what I need. And so there's just much more precision based exactly on what you guys are predicated on, based upon your metabolic profile. And as I started to see changes either in my weight or in my composition, in my performance, in my level of fatigue or level of energy, I really started to understand my body does not need what, Lucy's body needs, for instance. My body needs exactly what this needs. And that's just so individualized and so refined. So that's why I say something like MetPro, something that focuses on your metabolic demands, what your goals are, again, body composition versus weight loss, is going to be more fruitful than just thinking all across the board, this diet style is working for X, Y, and Z, it's going to work for me. And it also promotes thinking about nutrition in a more lifestyle oriented way versus food elimination or restriction, which I think is great for behavioral modification and just general kind of mental health. Because I'm probably one of the first to say that it can be psychologically stressful when you're trying to think about what you need to eat, particularly when you're not hitting your goals. Whole foods unprocessed, it's really exactly what it is. Eating clean, green, and lean is kind of how I break it down. Shop the periphery of the grocery store, and MetPro's fundamentals with respect to nutrition are eating in this way. And I've firsthand seen, as many of you probably have, just the particular increase, I think, in energy. My running is better. I think my professional life is better. Your mood is better. And just the stress about how you feel and how you look just gets much better. And I don't think there's much anxiety correlated to, well, I ate this way today, I'm going to freak out if the scale goes up tomorrow. I mean, I'm guilty of that, but I'm getting better and better. And then with respect to precision, like I said, you have to think about diet in a very individualistic way, because that's going to be the best way for you to minimize your cardiovascular risk. And that goes hand in hand with athletic performance. Diet, I think, will refine really any type of risk that you have. And performance is just kind of like the huge benefit that you can get from eating clean and eating well.
Wonderful. To follow up on the cardiovascular risk reduction, someone asked, what tests can we have performed to measure our cardiovascular health? What kind of medical tests are available?
Yeah, so the things that I typically do for what I call a risk stratification are, apart from looking at your blood pressure, looking at your heart rate, I'll typically do a cholesterol panel. So we'll look at your total cholesterol, your bad cholesterol, also known as your low density lipids or LDL. I will also take a look at glucose levels, specifically a hemoglobin A1C, which is about a 90-day estimate of sugar control. It's much better, more accurate than just getting an isolated fasting sugar level. And so those are kind of the two labs that I start with. If there's a genetic propensity for high cholesterol in the family, And my suspicion for that in my patient is also high. I'll also throw in a lipoprotein A. It's a genetically mediated molecule. You get a little bit from your mom, a little bit from your dad, and sometimes a high lipoprotein A we've seen is highly correlated with increased cardiovascular burden, sometimes prematurely. And in those people, I'm just much more strict with respect to cholesterol control, weight control, cardiovascular risk control. If you're someone, and this is kind of beyond that preliminary level of testing, if you're someone where we're kind of on the fence about what we want to do with respect to cholesterol management, maybe lifestyle is optimized and we're thinking about starting medication, coronary artery calcium scoring is quite common, just to see if there's any actual atherosclerotic disease that would warrant starting an aspirin and a statin or a cholesterol reducing medication. At the end of all of it, it's not so much about the testing, but about the lifestyle and behavioral modification that we're willing to do. And I always counsel my patients that it's not something that's going to be, required for a finite period of time. It really is a life change. And the patients that make the most progress are the ones who actually do it, get disciplined, are consistent, and change their lifestyle, change their way of thinking, and they are able to reap the benefits. I've had people who used to go from eating all red meat all the time within a month of even just eliminating red meat, eating cleaner, bring down their bad cholesterol by 50%. So those numbers, that objective data just acts as more fuel, more motivation to continue to do those habits that you've started to create.
Thank you. With kind of dovetailing with what you said, Dr. Singh, I have a question for you, Natalie. This came in, why do my meal plans keep changing? Don't I just get one meal plan forever?
Well, because we wouldn't have a job. I'm just kidding. Well, the meal plans change because your needs change and your metabolism is changing. Your goals are changing. I always explain, unless you're like, at some point, there will be a maintenance mode, but until you're at your goal, your body gets really good at figuring out what we're doing. And so and that's fine and dandy if you're at your goal, but if you're not, then we have to kind of work around that and try to catch it off guard. And so that is why we make changes, from every 3 days to every week, up, down, all around, but it's about nutritional contrast. And that's kind of like the big picture of what we're doing, what we're looking to achieve in getting someone to their goal. So it's kind of forcing their metabolism to do what we want till we get them to their goal. Yeah.
And Dr. Singh, since you've been using MetPro, it sounds like your strategies have changed a few times as well, I'm going to guess.
Yeah, I mean, when I first started, it was really about, I had just moved to Cleveland and I'd gained a couple of pounds and, I thought I was pretty healthy. I was at probably the lowest weight ever before I had moved. And I gained about 7 or 8 pounds. And so I thought, well, might as well try it, see what it's all about. It was quite intriguing. And I'm a big listener of the Marathon Training Academy, and I'd heard Natalie's interview. And I was like, oh my gosh, she sounds amazing. And then I just begged to have her as my coach. But so it initially started with a weight loss focus. And it was very interesting. I will say, initially when I started, it really did seem very intense with respect to me measuring things precisely. And it would take me a long time when I initially started to prepare my food because I was like, oh my gosh, I need to get like a scale and measure an ounce of nuts, and 1/3 of beans is like this much beans. And how do I survive on that? Oh my gosh. But you slowly get the hang of it. You recognize the foods you really like and you automatically know what those count as in macros. It gets easier and easier. We got my weight down, at least kind of reduced my body fat. And then my running started to kind of ramp up as well. I ran my first marathon in the fall of 2019. And so my goals changed. And I think, now what we've worked on a lot, maybe I share this with you because I want you to know that just because I'm a physician does not mean that I am immune and not privy to the normal thoughts of many people out there when we're looking to change the way we eat and how we look. I was and sometimes still feel like I'm a slave to the scale. And it took a lot, and it still takes a lot of work to realize that even though I lost 8 pounds of fat and I think have gained 8 pounds of muscle back, it takes a lot of reminder from my support system and Natalie to say, but you are stronger, you are faster, you're healthier now than you were before. And that is probably the biggest takeaway I take from doing MetPro and what I share with my patients, that it's not just a shift in how you look, it's literally a shift in how you think. And when Natalie was out on maternity leave, I worked with Cassie, and I think Cassie did so much work with respect to me learning to not be afraid of carbs and not to think of carbs and weight as negative. And it was just constantly reminding me, you're racing better, you're running faster, you're feeling stronger. Like, look at your pictures, things are shifting. And so that's kind of led me to today, where just got my 3rd marathon done, had a little bit of an injury that I'm still kind of trying to work through. So my running's kind of taken a bit of a hiatus. And we're focusing on strength training. And so I'm really excited about now building power and building more muscle. And, that may lead to a couple more pounds on board, but that's pounds of strength. And, I've learned to just be a little more forgiving when I do have those thoughts of, oh my gosh, I used to be like 10 pounds lighter on the scale. And I have to remind myself, but dude, you did not have glutes before. So it's just a process, but I don't think I would have gotten there without the amazing coaching that I've had. So
that's wonderful to hear, both for Coach Cassie and Coach Natalie. One question then, just to wrap up for you both. Natalie, I'll ask this to you first. Do you have any particular running goals here for the rest of the year? Anything you're looking forward to doing?
For me, I'm looking forward to cheering Tamanna on at CIM in December. I still am coming back from post pregnancy, so my running is not what it used to be, but hopefully, I'm probably going to look at racing more in next year. Hopefully there will be more races to choose from, but Tamanna's coming over to our turf over here to race, and it's a race that I've ran in the past, so Declan and I will be at the finish line.
Gotcha. And Dr. Singh, is that the next race looking on your radar?
Yeah, that's going to be probably the goal race. I have like trigger finger when it comes to races. I just tend to sign up for all of them. So I was supposed to do Marine Corps last year. I ran it virtually, but I'm signed up to do it this year. I think it's on Halloween. So those two are pretty close together, but I figured Marine Corps will be more of a kind of have fun and stop and take pictures and, run in a tutu style of race, and CIM will be more of the real thing. So those are the things I'm looking forward to. And then of course, strength training. My legs are dead from yesterday. Very excited for arm day tomorrow. I'm just excited about really getting more power behind this body. So.
Well, wonderful. Well, Dr. Singh, Natalie, thank you for joining us today. I wish you well in the upcoming race. Really appreciate all the information you shared. And thanks everybody who participated today. Really appreciate the great questions. Thanks, everyone. Bye-bye.
Thanks, Tamanna.
Thank you. Thanks, everybody.
Bye-bye.